very tight unless the labor conditions ease. I don't see Fed stepping down from their rate hikes. Maybe I think they're not going to do 50, but they should have done a 50. I think last FOMC, but they did not do it. Well, 25 is fine, and the next 25, and then the next another 25. So I think that's the way to go about it. And I think as long as Fed remains anywhere closer to or near around 5.5, I think the market will be able to digest it. Probably it might push down to probably, let's say, somewhere between 39 to 3,800. I would I would I would I would actually want to see it come down below 3,800, or probably come back down into that 3,700 level. But as of now, I don't think I'm going to get it. But if that comes back down again, and you have that Fed rate hitting 5.5, then we are looking for a pause, right? And then the market should recover based on that pause from Fed. I think the market should recover from about that 37, 38. If we get there, that's a big if. If the dips are not being bought, and we'll, in a minute we'll go into Apple, and also we'll look into SPX and ES. The MACDs are about to cross, right? So, but that's the whole process, whole thought process. The Fed risk is probably downgraded now. Then you had the Europe risk, and very likely they were thinking that, or they were projecting that they will run out of energy, yada yada yada, tough winter. That did not happen. Now the energy crisis is slowly calming down. The energy prices are slowly backing down. So that very likely, that crisis has passed, or at least the crisis, the fears of that, the crisis being pushing Europe into a severe recession, that is done, right? That is past too. So that those fears are alleviating now. Now the other one was China. China COVID, China reopened, and they kind of declared it's a different story whether it's real, not unreal. We don't care. What the government saying there is that they have won this COVID war, and this COVID thing is done. It's behind China now. So we take for what they are giving us, and we go along with that. So what does that mean? The China reopen story is still intact without any major hiccups. That China story is still intact. So these three major global, what do you call, issues now are pretty much subsided. So what do you have next? Probably, in the short term, you look at valuations. In the short term, you look at, Fed going a little bit above 5.5. Those are all there. But by and large, I still don't see a reason for markets to make a new lows, unless, of course, you have Fed going above 5.5 or closer to 6 and staying there for longer, and that breaking the labor market substantially above, let's say, 4.5, somewhere about closer to 5. If that happens at a faster pace, I'm not right now. I'm not looking at that happening at a faster pace. But in case that happens at a faster pace, then we'll see some more weakness in SPX, right? So with that background, let's get into it. Right. So dollar, I think, has pretty much peaked, and if you want to front run this thing, you want to look at FXY, because that's where the pressure is coming from, the dollar, for the dollar. Now you want to be watching this chart. If dollar comes back up and tests this number 104.73 area, then I think we have furthermore on the DXY side of things, and you want to wait for this to come clear. If the 10-year crosses above that 3.93, what is that number? I forgot. Uh, where is that chart? Right here. So if the 10-year goes up beyond this 3.96 at some point in time, let's put it a range, 3.96, and this one standard deviation about 3.98. So let's put a range 3.96 to 3.98. So that would be about 8 to 10 basis points from where we are right now. So if that happens, then you will see DXY come back up into that 104.7 area, 104.7 to 104.8 area, and probably it'll start to take a breather there. Let's get into DXY real chart. We were looking, our target was 104.5, right? We knew it was going to go above that, but we were counting on 104, 104.5. I don't know if you have a recording for past couple of days. If we have that, go look at it. Our target was 104.5. That's all we wanted from that. So why? Because we knew that if that happens, then we will get this thing down to at least this number, 4084 area, right? That was the math that we were counting on. Of course, DXY did go a little higher, and ES or SPX pushed down a little bit further, right? So the math worked out better in our case, right? And if it starts to push down, we are expecting it to come back into 4058. I'm hoping this would happen, and actually I'm counting on this to happen. Why? Because we have the crossover here to the downside, right? MACD has crossed to the downside. Now, if we go look at Apple here, Apple is about to cross to the downside. We went long here. We should exit. Not if I am not in this trade as of now. I exited this trade, Apple trade, right here, right? And it hit that and took a pretty decent downside turn, and that was due. That was due for it to come back down. And last time it hit that, it came back right down, and this time it hit that, came back right down. So expectation is that now for this line to hold, right? If Apple comes down 150.28, let's round that up at 150. That is the expectation right now. If it comes back down, it needs to hold there for today. And if that breaches, we are looking for further downside, probably next week into 146 or something. For now, I'm looking for this to hold. If that breaches for some reason, then we're looking for 149.60. If that breaches, the 5 on the week is where it should stop. And today is OPEX. That and also Monday. This weekend is a long weekend, right? Monday is a holiday, so that might change things a bit. But by and large, I think it should stop around 150 area. 150. Yeah, this is the one that I'm looking at. And bigger picture is, well, we knew this yesterday that it will come back down into this 8 and probably hold this here. And if it breaches here, next come back down into this 150, looking for a bounce. Not really plotting anything sub 150 today for Apple, but for some reason it breaches there and should come back into the mean reversion. Mean reversion hasn't happened for Apple for a long time. Last time it did hit the mean was somewhere about here, right? So it is due for a mean reversion, and that's what we're we're betting on right now. So let's see it come back into this 150 area, and by the time if it starts to give us a confirmation here to the downside, and very likely it will breach this and come back into the mean reversion, mean breaks, then expecting it to hit this 200 moving average. This is where I think a majority of the market participants, it will start to that pull and push kind of thing. And why am I looking at that? If it starts to come back down here into 200 moving average, you will see these technicals here. These will be pretty oversold here, right? Anytime you see this thing come back down here, the RSI, it will start to bounce. Anytime it will come back down, bounce, come back down, bounce. So same thing, expecting that thing to be oversold here, come back down, hit this lower end of the spectrum, and we'll expect another bounce from there. How sustainable bounce? I don't know that yet, but we'll keep a close watch on that. Basically, if I'm going by the daily chart, 5 breach, 8 breach, then the upper inner Bollinger Band, that breaches, then comes the mean, then comes the 200 moving average. This is the path it's going to take to the downside. So if this crosses here, right here, the MACD crosses, that will confirm, and all the position traders who took a position here will very likely exit the position now, right? So that's the idea here to the downside. And if we get this trade moving to the upside, right now it's overbought and it's coming back down to the bottom here of the spectrum, and we can expect another bounce here. Probably we can expect a bounce here at 104.20 area. But if that breaches, very likely it's going to come down here into 104.12. Then very likely we'll see it come back down here into 104. If DXY takes this path to the downside, then I will not be looking forward for another push down in ES or SPX, right? I will not be looking for that push to the downside if DXY takes this path to the downside. If DXY bounces, let's say here, based on this chart, how much of a bounce? Probably it will come back up here into the 5, and probably here into 104.45 area. Beyond that, I think it's a bit it's a hard ask right now. It ran up super hard, super fast. This should not have happened. It should have gradually moved up, right? It should have gradually moved up after the market opens. Then it should have taken this flight. That means we should have pushed down on the SPX side of things after the market opens. Now it's a hard ask for it to actually reverse course and start to push into 104.70 area, right? And that will happen only and only if you see 10-year moving higher. So that's the idea there. Cool thing. So ES to the downside, let's get into the actual numbers. ES to the downside, this was pretty much given, right? Pretty much this number, 46. I exited my puts trade here, and it's been bouncing ever since. Fair enough, let it do its thing. And now let's say if it comes back down into 4070, or rather 4068, whatever this 5 is. If it breaches there, then I'm expecting it to come back down and give us another probably 30 points from where it is right now, right? So from the 5, the lows of the day, probably that would be about 4068. Then it comes back down into 4044. That's about 25 points, right? So that's about 0.5%, give or take. So that's the idea here. If it breaches the 5, then we are looking at the 8. And I was betting for this 5 to hold, and that's why I sold those 4040s, right? And now that 4040s will go worthless. And those were very expensive yesterday. The AM expiration, that was very expensive. The moment it hit this number, it started to kind of bounce, and those premiums started to dwindle. And not really expecting it to. There's something called set. So unless that that is the number where it decides if all the stocks has opened or not. So that takes about another 10 minutes after the market opened, and I'm not really expecting it to break, right at 9:30 or something like that. If it breaches, then very likely we're expecting it to come back down into this number 4042 for ES. So subtract 10 points from where it is, from that 4042. Probably you'll expect about 4030, 4032 to 4034 area on SPX, right? And let's go here for the 1 hour chart. Oversold conditions, hitting a major moving average, bouncing nothing out of ordinary here. Pretty straightforward trade. 5 hit. If that clears, it's going to hit this inner Bollinger Band. The thesis says if it clears the inner Bollinger Band, and then it's going to go hit this number at the mean, and probably 4088 is where it should take a breather. And if Apple starts to bounce, we'll get into Apple 1 hour chart. If Apple starts to bounce, it will very likely clear this number at 4090. So that means about 4080 on SPX, and then very likely we'll start to push into again 4100 for ES. That means about 4090 on SPX. So let's go here. This chart. This is same thing. Hits the bottom, bounces. Hits the bottom, bounces. Nothing crazy. And then it's. I was well. Actually, let's go here for this one. Right. 152 bounce. Fair enough. We are looking at that bounce right now. And if that breaches down, then we are expecting it to push down probably into this number 151 50 area. If Apple clears this number right here, I think Apple will go hit this number momentarily, 152.95, 153. If Apple clears that number, then we are looking for Apple to push into this number, 153.30. And if Apple starts to clear this 50 moving average, then the mean reversion is sitting at about 144.50 area, and there's no real reason to look forward for a downside if Apple stays above this 50 on the hour. So that means there's a lot of strength for Apple, and very likely if Apple stays above this 50 moving average on the hour, there's no real reason for us to look for the downside. Let's get into this trade here, Microsoft. Right, Microsoft, well, it needs to hold this number here, 259, somewhere about here. That breaches, we are looking for. Yesterday, if anybody remembers, I was saying I'm still looking forward for 2 to 2.5 points downside. We got that, right? And if that breaches, very likely it's going to come back into 257.44, and not really plotting anything sub 5 on the week for Microsoft, 255. Now I will manage that trade here, and also I'm watching this. If the MACD crosses on the daily to the downside, then very likely it'll start to become a trend. And ideally, we want to see Microsoft come back down here, breach this lower upper inner Bollinger Band, and come back down here to 57 and test the mean reversion. And also Microsoft, if it breaches below here, about 253, the 200 moving average, this should be a pretty decent bounce spot. And I'm expecting Microsoft to first bounce here about 260. That breaches next bounce here at 257. Then the mean reversion will be absolute bounce here. How far of a bounce? I don't know. If that breaches, then it's going to come back down here, and then we look for another bounce. Why am I looking for bounces? Look at this thing. It is going to be hitting the bottom again. So that's the reason I'll keep looking for those bounces. If it comes back down here, it's going to bounce. Same thing. Right, so that's the technical play, and this is if you're looking for a larger move, then you want to watch the MACD, both on Microsoft and Apple. And if, well, this chart, well, right here it should bounce. Microsoft. This is not Microsoft. Where is that 1 hour chart? Right here. Right. So 1 hour chart is getting oversold, and we are expecting Microsoft to bounce. If it clears right about here, 261, that clears to the upside. Then the 8 is sitting at 261.70. That clears, very likely it's going to go hit this 267, 262.70 area. We will reassess to the upside. If it clears this 262.70 area, probably we'll start to look for it and to come back here. There you go. As we speak, it's happening. 263.70, 80, then very likely it's going to come back here and stall right about here, 264. And if it starts to push to the downside, I'll be looking for a bounce again here at 258. If that breaches the 200 moving average on the 1 hour, this is where I'll be looking for a bounce. And I generally play SPX, right? I generally play SPX, but the idea for doing idea for catching SPX, the direction wise, that comes from Apple and Microsoft, right? So that's the reason we are looking at these Microsoft and Apple. And let's get into Tesla. This is the momentum indicator, rather your sentiment indicator. Sentiment soured yesterday because of that report came out. They said it's a recall. It's not a recall. It's just over-the-air update, right? So it's not a real recall. And Tesla to the upside, we are still tracking this line here, 220. If that clears, we are looking forward for a push all the way up here into 220. Come on, right here. 224. If that 220 clears, we're looking for push into 224. And for Tesla to the downside, 5 breaches, 8 bounces. If 8 breaches, then we are looking forward for a push down here into 190. That breaches, very likely it's going to come back into 183, and very likely it's going to come back here. If the mean breaches 180, 180 breaches, then very likely we're going to see it 175. Not a story for today, but probably it's a story for next week, especially if this thing crosses to the downside. And it just doesn't mean that if it crosses to the downside, you go take a trade to the downside, but it gives you an idea of where the traders are. Here the traders were long. Here very likely that trade will come off, right? So if you're going long, you have to be careful. That's what that means. And if it crosses to the downside, that's when you take larger positions to the downside, right? And here you can probably trade this thing cautiously to the downside unless it crosses to the downside. Cool thing. Let's get here for Tesla. Same story, just like Microsoft and Apple, it's doing the same thing, and it's good actually. All these charts are behaving the exact same way, so that we don't really have to go look for different charts pulling the market in different directions. If the sentiment indicator says we are going up, very likely it's going to go up, hit this 202.50 first breather. If that clears, very likely it's going to go hit 204.20, and very likely it's going to go hit this 204.70 to 205 area. If just like that Apple, if this thing clears the 50 moving average to the upside, then I would expect it to revert to the mean on the hour. If that reversion happens, then very likely it's going to push all the way up here into 210. If it clears this 210, then we'll likely plot some further upside. Till then, we are watching this number here, 202.68 area, then very likely it's going to go hit this number 204 area for a breather, and we want to see it consistently above 204.88 for sustained upside for SPX. Cool thing. But by and large, I'll be watching this guy here, 2.89. It's going to go hit this 2.9, very likely, 2.95 area, and very likely it's going to take a breather there. So that's what I'm watching. And if in fact it doesn't do that and start to take a breather right away, that's another problem that you will come across right here. You want to watch this thing, right? We just plotted this thing. If it breaches here, it's going to come back down here. Then we'll look for another bounce. If that breaches, very likely it's going to come back down here. And if that starts to come back down, it will not stop until it reaches this 104 area. If it comes back down here into 104, then we'll reassess the further downside. Uh, I'm looking for bounces just like what is happening here. Why? Because these technicals are making it bounce. After the bounce, probably how far the bounce would be. Probably it might come back up here into this upper inner Bollinger Band, 104.36, or even it might last into 104.40 area. And we'll reassess if it clears this 5 and 8 on the hour to the upside. Cool thing. Anything else in particular we are looking at? Sounds like your biases to the bird. Yes, 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 yes. Yeah, my bias is to the downside, and that's why I picked up some S triple Q, and I'm looking to exit that trade today, right? Unless there is some more weakness that comes from Apple, there's no real reason to hold on to that S triple Q trade, right? We were just looking at this trade; it is hitting that trade, right? So, and obviously, I did not check this thing. It should be moving. There you go. Cool thing. So if it clears here, it's gonna go hit this number. And again, no mega death or no death or none of that, right? So simple, straightforward weekly technicals getting hit. Uh, five. If the five clears, then we're looking for downside into the eight. Nothing more than that. Cool thing. Anything in particular we are looking at? Okay. We still have 5 more minutes. I'll go get a cup of tea or something. Let's move into live trading.